welcome to Camp Constitution Radio with your host, Hal Shurtleff, who still has a little bit of a nagging cough. Anyway, this show is heard on WBCQ The Planet every Monday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it is sponsored by Camp Constitution, which, among other things, runs a family camp a week and a day long, which this year's camp is running from July 2nd to July 9th, and we are excited about the very special instructors we're having this year, including Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and Professor Willie Soon, who's one of the top climate realists in the country. Please visit us on our website, campconstitution.net, and make sure you check out the Sam Blumenfeld archives. Sam was a dear friend of ours, and he left us many of his works and writings, and we have just an incredible collection of items on that website. Anyway, we have a guest on the line, and it's Robert Brown from Montana. How you doing, Robert?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Well, coming up this week, we're going to be you're going to be with us in New Hampshire and Maine. We're going to be in New Hampshire at the press conference at the State House, the LOB, Legislative Office Building. That would be Tuesday, tomorrow, at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a press conference. And we've got word that our dear friends of Convention of States were going to be on hand to probably try to counter what we're doing. But we're just a little bitty organization, and they've got millions of dollars, and they have to come and bother us. They get on all of the neocon talk shows pretty much anytime they want, but little bitty groups like ours and the John Birch Society and many, some other Eagle Forum, we're still doing a good job of preventing this Article 5. So anyway, that's going to be a press conference open to the public at the lobby of the Legislative Office Building right behind the State Capitol tomorrow at 11 a.m. And then at the Nashua Library, 2 Court Street in Nashua, New Hampshire, that would be at 7 o'clock. And you give a phenomenal presentation, about an hour long, I'm guessing?
Yes,
Robert?
Approximately.
Yeah,
that's
and then
correct.
Maine, we're going to have a press conference at the State Capitol. It's in the Welcome Center on Wednesday. That's 2 days from now at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then a presentation at the Lithgow Library, 6:30. That's the library right in Augusta on, I think it's Western Avenue, but it's the main library there. And then the following day, you're going to be speaking in Waldoboro, Maine. That's Central Coastal Maine, 7 p.m. at the American Legion, 181 Jefferson. Well, Robert, you have been dealing with this issue for many years. You're also, by the way, for the listeners, Robert is the creator of this incredible 6 DVD set called The Constitution is the Solution, which is available through Shop JBS and probably some other places. So, Robert, talk a little bit about your background, why your credentials to speak on this topic of the dangers of an Article 5 convention.
I'm often asked if I'm an attorney, and no, I'm not an attorney. I'm an avid student of the Constitution and of history, often referred to as a constitutional scholar. And, of course, with that, I can always claim that, I studied law at the same law school as Thomas Jefferson, which is, he studied it as a home study course. But the real issue here is, as we look into the history and facts of the Constitution, the writings of those who drafted the Constitution, it becomes very clear what the original intent actually was. And there's not a lot of confusion or debate among constitutional scholars that seek that approach.
The Article 5 supporters, those who want to have a convention to write amendments, many of them will tell us that the founders put this Article 5 convention in that for the purpose of, at some point in our nation's history, the Congress will not be answerable to the people, the federal government will become runaway, and this is the only way we can restore our republic. Is there any truth to that?
No, there's not. In fact, if that were true, I would expect the founders would have said so at some point. And yet, as you look through the history of any time you see any of the founding fathers, particularly the framers of the Constitution, talking about Article 5 and the purpose of it, they always use such phrases as, this is for the amendment of errors in the Constitution. If we find a flaw in the Constitution, then we've supplied a remedy, Article 5, whether it be through conventions or through Congress, to make changes or amendments to the Constitution. Every time they talk about using Article 5, it's to repair problems with the Constitution, which is a separate issue from when they talk about if the government oversteps their constitutional bounds, what should you do? For example, in Federalist 46, James Madison goes into a list of various tools that are available to the people and to the states for putting in check federal government that oversteps the bounds of the Constitution. And notably absent from his list is the Article 5 Convention. I wonder why.
What type of things did he recommend? Someone who was known as the father of the Constitution. So, in other words, if anybody should know anything about the Constitution, it should be the guy that is referred to as the father of the Constitution.
Well, certainly. One of the first ones that I'll point to here, he uses some great Old English that I'd love to see a revival of. He refers to the disquietude of the people is a great power against overstepping the bounds of the Constitution. What is disquietude referring to?
That means when people get ticked off, right?
Exactly. You get enough people ticked off about how you're performing in office, you're not going to get reelected. And he pointed to that as a very powerful tool. In fact, preceding his list, he said the means of opposition to overstepping constitutional bounds are powerful and at hand. And he gives this list, that being the first one on the list. If the people are aware of what's going on and they're upset about it, you're not getting back into office for reelection. That's a powerful tool, but there are many others as well.
Well, it's interesting. Robert, I testified recently in New Hampshire in favor of a resolution to rescind New Hampshire's one call, and the person who preceded me was an Article 5 supporter, and he made the case. Well, Congress, and he was a state rep, Jordan Ullery, and he said, well, Congress won't be. They're down in Washington, and they're not listening to us. And when I got a chance to testify, it says, interesting that New Hampshire sends 4 delegates to Congress. Of course they listen to us. We elect them. They, they're supposed to listen to us. The whole idea that somehow Washington is a separate country, totally not responsible for the people, is nonsense. That's why we have frequent elections. And I think that's one of the things that James Madison called for, frequent elections. That's one of the best barriers to an unresponsive leaders, or unresponsive people in government.
Absolutely. But notice that he's not only talking about the re-election, but he's also talking about between elections, this disquietude of the people when your elected officials start hearing from their constituents, even in between elections. That is a great way to put pressure on them. You don't have to wait till a ballot box. You need to be calling your elected officials now while they're in session so that they feel the support or disapproval as they're going along. So elections aren't enough by themselves for sure.
And also, for example, the issue of Common Core. People are quite upset about it around the country. They contact their locals reps, their school committee members, their state reps, and members of Congress. And in most cases, if they don't talk about Common Core and oppose it, they may not get elected. And so that's really where a lot of this impetus should come for. If the people really want limited government, if they want to have, get rid of some of these things, then they should be calling for it. And I like to think that our last election helped some of that. People who are now in office that were in office before are answerable to the people, and they're going to Congress and going to the state houses to do just that, to limit the size and scope of government.
Absolutely. And, Common Core is a great example of one of the other remedies in Federalist 46 that Madison refers to. He talks about the refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. Our state legislators, our governors should be doing that with Common Core. If the people of their state say, we don't want Common Core, they shouldn't be forcing it upon them. They should be standing up for the will of the people against the federal government. Refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. It also mentions another one here that's similar, which is they should be enacting legislative devices to present obstructions to the federal government.
Yeah, and that's in the Federalist 46.
Yes, that's Federalist 46.
So what he's basically saying is that states can tell the federal government to pound sand.
Absolutely.
And isn't that what the 10th Amendment's all about? The certain things.
If you were to take the 10th Amendment and the Supremacy Clause and Federalist 33, let me tie those three together for you. Obviously, the 10th Amendment says powers that weren't given to the federal are reserved to the states or the people. The Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and all laws made in pursuance of the Constitution. Any laws made in following the Constitution are supreme. Now you turn to Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 33, and he explained that laws that are made that are not in pursuance of the Constitution are, quote, merely acts of usurpation and deserve to be treated as such. He's saying the same thing Madison said. The states have a duty to oppose laws passed by the federal government that are not in pursuance of the Constitution. That's what their oath of office literally means, which is also in Article 6 of the Constitution. They're supposed to swear an oath not to subservience to the federal government, but to uphold the Constitution, even if the federal government isn't, especially if the federal government is not upholding the Constitution. That's the meaning of the oath of office.
Obamacare and a lot of the gun control federal legislation. There was an incident recently. You may be aware. I think it was in Kansas, where someone who manufactures guns has a gun shop. He was adhering to state law, and the feds came in. And are you familiar with that case? And
yeah, I've heard about that one.
Was it Kansas or was it Missouri? Well, one of the two.
I don't recall.
And basically, the state passed laws saying that as long as the stuff manufactured within the state, what have you, it's not subject to federal law. But they're not willing. It could have been done with a different administration, a different attorney general. So they're not willing to enforce the laws they made. Of course, hopefully the new attorney general will pursue it. Now, the Article 5 supporters tell us, for example, that there's all kinds of wonderful safeguards built in to the process. That first off, a convention is limited, so a runaway convention is impossible. So can you address, and they'll say that, and even if it did, and they'll say, yeah, gee, it may, 3/4 of the states still are required to ratify any amendments. So we have nothing to worry about because we have all these wonderful Republicans all over the country, and they would never ratify anything that's silly or crazy. So could you address that? I think it's probably one of the most important objections. So I think we need to, address that if you could.
Absolutely. To address this, I want to touch on two separate issues. The first one is to believe that you have to believe that history cannot repeat itself. Because the runaway convention concept is really the pivotal issue here. And of course, the everlasting debate here is, did the 1787 convention, where our current Constitution was created, was it a runaway convention? Well, how do we define a runaway convention? I would say that we could all agree a runaway convention is one that's given certain bounds of power and then ignores those bounds of power. If that's a runaway convention, what bounds of power was the 1787 convention given? In fact, Mark Meckler, in his debate with Lawrence Lessig at the Intelligence Square debate last December, said, if you want to know what their authority was, James Madison says in Federalist 40, look to their commission. Well, I agree. That's exactly right. And as I look to the commission from each of the states that were given to the delegates, 9 states all made reference to Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, where it lists how ratification will happen to any changes to be made to it. 9 states told their delegates, whatever you come up with at this convention will be following the Article 13 ratification process. What was that? That was all 13 state legislatures and Congress have to approve or ratify any new changes. Is that what they did? Not at all.
No.
They threw out that ratification process, even though 9 states delegates had specific instructions referring to that. They ignored that, threw it out, created a much easier ratification process. And of that, Madison himself declared, it is admitted that the delegates have departed from the tenor of their commission. Did they follow their commission? No, he said it's admitted they did not. That's the issue here. If we are giving our convention delegates today a commission, here are the rules you've got to abide by. If they follow the example of 1787, they can also depart from the commissions we give them and do whatever they want. Now, so there's no guarantee that it'll be a limited convention if history repeats itself.
Now, Article 5 supporters like Mike Farris, who is no longer with the Convention of States, he said that basically if you believe that, then you're saying the Constitution is unconstitutional and you're a pretty rotten individual. That's basically his philosophy. Can you address that question?
Yeah,
I think that's another,
They throw out this idea that you must be saying the Constitution is illegally adopted. The reason they say that is they have nowhere to go to refute what I just said. And so out of a desperate attempt, well, that's crazy. You're just saying the Constitution was illegally adopted. They can't refute what I said, so they're going to mock it. But I've never said the Constitution was illegally adopted. In fact, on this, I'll also defer to James Madison in Federalist 40, where he talks about all throughout the Federalist 40 that they're going to appeal to a higher authority. The limits of power were placed upon them by Congress, by the states, and by the existing Constitution. What is a higher authority than all of those in this country? The highest authority he refers to as the people themselves.
The people, yeah.
And that convention appealed to the power of the people, in Madison's own words, to abolish or alter their government as to them may seem best to fit their safety and happiness.
And that comes out of the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, exactly. It's a reference from the Declaration of Independence. So if you are going to appeal to a higher power authority, do you still have to obey the lower authority? No. If I go to a store, I'm asking a store clerk, hey, I have a special deal here. If I buy 100 of these items, can I get a special price? Oh, no, I can't let you do that. Can I talk to your boss, the owner? You go and talk to the owner, and he says yes. Do you still have to get permission of that clerk? No, of course not.
No.
He just went over his head. In the same way, by appealing to the power of the people, you're going over the head of the state, of Congress, and the existing Constitution. And by doing that, what they did was authoritative. It wasn't the Constitution being illegally adopted. Now, you have to understand that now comes the question, do you believe that was a legitimate authority? If you don't believe it was legitimate for the convention to ignore the limits of power and appeal to the power of the people, then you must believe the Constitution was illegally adopted. I do not.
Yeah.
So that really puts it back on them. They either have to deny history, or they have to admit the Constitution was illegally adopted, or lastly, they have to admit that that power was legitimate and it still exists today. The convention can today do the same thing.
I just finished rereading the Christianity and the Constitution by John Eidsmoe, who is an attorney and a constitutional scholar. By the way, Mike Farris endorsed the book. And John, attorney, he's also a colonel, I think an Air Force colonel, but he was always been against an Article 5 convention, and he actually had a little highlight. He highlighted some of the founders, including Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and who was a delegate to the convention. And he had some issues with, he supported the Constitution, the new one, the one we're under now, but he had some misgivings because he did, sort of usurp their state's resolution, but their commission. But he reconciled it by saying that every state had violated the Articles of Confederation, and when a state does that, it is the document's considered null and void. Have you ever heard that expressed before?
Not other than by Eidsmoe himself. That's the only place I've heard that before. That's an interesting perspective, though.
Yeah, I don't know what exactly they. Yeah.
If you take that as a precedent, every state has violated the current compacts of the Constitution, and therefore that would mean the Article 5 requirements would no longer be in force either. Every state is violating the Constitution, even just on constitutional money. Article 1, Section 10 says, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin tender in payment of debt. No state is obeying that right now.
That's
one of many examples that could be given of every state violating the Constitution. Of course, though, another factor is that the vast majority of unconstitutional programs being implemented by the federal government require the states' help in implementing them. So in that way, the states are also violating the Constitution, helping implement unconstitutional federal programs.
The director, the founder of Convention of States, Mark Meckler, he made a statement that would oppose an Article 5 convention, and that statement can be found on livingroomconversations.org, he's listed along with Van Jones as champions of this liberal group. And I don't have the quote in front of me. It's like 2 paragraphs. But he said that elites run both D.C. and state capitals. Well, if that's the case, why? I mean, I'm looking at this. I have a little bit of I took a little logic in college, and if someone tells me, if he really means this, if elites are running the state capitals and running D.C., why would we want the elites behind an Article 5 convention if they're in cahoots with the elites in D.C.? Why would we want elites having anything to do with that? To me, that would justify not having one. And it's almost as if the supporters just brush this off like he never said it. Oh, he never said, well, no, that's not what he meant. And Mike Farris has openly called for structural change or restructuring the Constitution. Well, I'm not an engineer, but I know a lot of people who are. And I say, well, if you restructure something, you're making some profound changes. If I'm restructuring a building, I'm not just painting one of the rooms. I'm doing some serious stuff to the structure. And they'll say, well, it needs to be restructured. It's already been, so they dance around that. If you tell me you got a couple of amendments that you want to propose that are going to somehow save our republic, that's one thing. But now they're talking about restructuring, you see. Or
right.
Mr. Cenk Uygur of the founder of Wolfpack, I have him on video. I was there when he said it. He was advocating a runaway. And I think you defined a runaway, but and I think you said the Convention of States current resolutions, you say there's nowhere to run because it's just still open,
Yes, absolutely.
But a runaway
you could fit just about any amendment in there.
It's almost a bait and switch. If I'm a state rep or a state senator, and I'm told that this convention will only deal with a balanced budget amendment, and by the way, that's not such a great idea if they really look in the fine print. So I'll say, great, then I'm going to support that because the delegates can only talk about a balanced budget amendment, and then they get down there, they'll say, yeah, my commission said balanced budget amendment, but I'm not binding to that since Article 5 never talks about Article 5 of the Constitution, the word amendments, anything about one amendment. So I'm going to go ahead and propose a whole bunch of others.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this too: we're told that there's all kinds of precedents for these kinds of things, and we have colonial compacts, and we have nothing to worry about because all these wonderful rules are already laid out for any potential delegates to follow. How do you handle that one?
Good question. One of the things to look to is how many of these other interstate conventions that they like to point to were actually Constitution amending conventions. And at that point, we start kind of drawing a blank because we don't have a long list of precedent of Constitution amending conventions other than if we look to state conventions, such as in my own state of Montana in 1972, we had a state constitutional convention which had the power to make changes to our state constitution. And what they chose to do was to throw it out and create a new one. And that's historically what we see over and over again in these state conventions, is that when delegates are faced with the choice of making some minor changes or to create a whole new document, they want to become part of history, become the new founding fathers of their state by creating a completely new document. They get to make their mark on history.
Do you know how many state conventions have been held since Massachusetts held the first one in 1780? I thought the figure was a little over 200. And the other day, our friend there with Convention of States Ken Quinn said there were over 600. I don't think there were that many. Do you know the figure offhand?
I don't know exactly how many. I know there have been many, and it's really not important how many there have been. But what is important is what we learn from them. There have been many of them that have been runaway conventions. And that's the other false history that's often claimed out there. These conventions would never run away. But that's not true at all.
It's interesting they say this, and when I first heard that articulated, I didn't have the answer. I didn't know, so I did some research, and that's what's. Hey, I hear something. Let me check it out. Well, it is like you mentioned, Montana in 1972. I did know that New York State in the late 60s wrote a new constitution at their convention. Pennsylvania in the 1840s, and I got this from a book called Colored Patriots of the Revolution. In 1840 or 41, they held a convention, and they disenfranchised the blacks from voting, which they could vote prior to that.
Wow.
So there was still some Revolutionary War black veterans still alive, and they were there to say, hey, we shed blood for this country, and you're not even gonna let us vote. In Massachusetts, in 1820, they made some profound changes. What maybe by not today's standards, you had to be a Christian in order to run for office, and they changed that. Now today, it's probably what's the big deal, but in 1820, it was a big deal. So many other examples of. I think there's actually a book that was published in the early 1900s that was talking about all these states and all these state conventions that did make some profound changes. So,
if I may, there's one topic that we were talking about earlier I want to jump back to for just another moment.
Certainly.
You were asking about, here we have now a Republican majority in more states than ever before and so on. They couldn't possibly pass that amendment. A great example of this being a false idea, Convention of States did us a great favor. Last September 2016, they held what is often referred to as the mock convention, a convention simulation where they invited delegates from all 50 states. Most of them were state legislators. They ended up with 137 total delegates there to basically do a kind of a dry run to practice. Here's how a convention works. And from that convention, they came up with 6 amendment proposals. The first thing I did upon researching this convention after the fact was I went through the list of 137 delegates and researched every one of them to determine what is their political leanings and affiliation and so on. I found that 4 of them were Democrats. Out of 137, there were 4 Democrats. There was 1 Libertarian, Republican turned Libertarian, and the rest were Republican/conservative. So with approximately 97% Republican-leaning conservative, here's what they came up with. They came up with 6 amendment proposals, every one of which I consider constitutionally flawed. For someone who's a constitutional scholar, you look at these and recognize these are causing problems with the Constitution. For example, one of them in particular says we're going to give the state legislatures the power to overturn federal law. It'll take 3/5 of the states to do so. And they specifically mention it can overturn federal law that is passed by Congress or by the president or by the federal regulatory agencies. Now the question is, where in the Constitution is the president given the authorization to create federal law? Of course, the answer is he's not, unless we pass this amendment. At that point, you just authorized the president to create law. You also authorized the federal bureaucracies, the federal agencies, to also now have constitutional authority to make federal law. We just expanded power of the federal government with this amendment proposal with a 97% Republican conservative group. They're expanding federal power.
It's interesting, too.
That's not a danger with a current majority of states having Republican majority.
Hey, Robert, we have 1 minute left. The fastest 30 minutes in radio here. So just 1 minute left. We'll just mention that you're going to be you're available to. You're a speaker. You're speaking on a national scene. And if people are like, we're going to be taking you in New Hampshire and Maine, and you've spoken Virginia, and I know you speak out west as well, how can people get a hold of you if they're interested in having you speak on this subject or debate, if that's the case?
Certainly. And the best way to do that is to book me through JBS themselves, the John Birch Society. I'm doing a speech tour across the country for them presently, and they're booking my locations. I'm going to Boise, Idaho this past week, going to Salt Lake City in a couple of weeks, and on and on. So to book me, they're the ones that are scheduling my visits and so on.
All right, and you also, a lot of your presentations and hearing talks are on YouTube as well.
Absolutely.
So go to put down Article 5, Robert Brown, and you're going to get a good history lesson and a good lesson in civics. Okay, looking forward to working with you later this week. God bless, and thank you for listening. You've been listening to WBCQ The Planet. Good night.
Thank you for having me.